Again, I would like to welcome everybody, and I would like to acknowledge all the work that Miss Dottie and Miss Beth has put into all of this, and to all of our wonderful donors. It has been very difficult to bring everything together, but they have achieved it. Thank you also to the Ministry of Agriculture. In our presence, we have our Minister of Agriculture. Thank you very much. They have willingly given us all their establishments to use. We have our major donors up here, which is the government of Belize, the DFC, which is one of our lending institutions. They have always been very supportive of agriculture in many different aspects. We have our DigiNet, not to mention the Embassy of Taiwan in Belize. They have been with us for many, many years. I think they just celebrated about, 30 years? And over those 30 years, they've had a major impact. They've always worked very closely with the rural farmers, the very small, poor farmers, through the Ministry of Agriculture. They have very successful with vegetables, then with aquaculture. Now they're promoting the sheep project, which is well on its way. I know many farmers have received their genetic sheep already of much better genetics, so that's well on the way. Then we have the Red Plus people, they're here also. And the Caribbean Climate Change Center, which plays a very important part in the whole dynamics behind regenerative agriculture. So why are we here? What is regenerative agriculture? What is this all about? Why not just organic agriculture or permaculture or aquaculture or all these different types of agriculture that we talk about? Or why not just stick to conventional agriculture? It's doing fine. We're still alive. We've only destroyed most of the planet, but not all of it. So it's all right. Why regenerative agriculture? Well, very simply, regenerative agriculture is taking everything that we know and making it work together. So we have very healthy, dense, nutritious food that is accessible to everybody. And I hope that all of the professionals that are here will be able to inspire us to achieve that. It is not difficult. It is not rocket science. Everybody can do this. Mr. Nesbitt down south has tried, he has failed. No, he hasn't. He has a very mature system that I invite everybody, including myself. I have not been, but last year he presented, and he has a mature system of an edible forest. He's now producing tons and tons of food from small areas. These are projects that started off as little projects, but are now successful. They're there. There's many, many examples in the country of Belize that we can utilize. So what I would like is that we can get inspired that there's only one thing we require for us to be successful. And it's not knowing everything. That's not that important. There's lots of brains in here that already know that. You go to them when you don't know. That's what I do. And when they fail, I go to Google. He knows. A mindset. We need to change our mindset, our approach to how we're producing our food. It breaks my heart sometimes when we go into the stores, into the supermarkets across the country. Any supermarket we go, aisle after aisle after aisle is full of imported commodities. Some of them are good, but a lot of them are junk. We have very resilient people in this country. There was once a school called Belize College of Agriculture. It's now called University School of Belize or something like that. And it says, land and people are our country's most valuable resources. And we have both. We have abundant water. We have good water. We have fertile soil. We have a young population. Within Central America, Belize, I don't know the exact data, but we might have one of the youngest populations. We also, without a doubt, have some of the most educated young people. But yet, we don't see the tangible fruits in the supermarkets. I will say, for my area, the San Ignacio Farmers Market is a very beautiful market, and it has grown every year. I've visited that market for over 40 years. And it has grown consistently, and it keeps growing. But not the whole country is like that. And some of the commodities, you can see they're laced with chemicals. I won't get into that part, because that's not the objective of this introduction. But we have the knowledge. We have the resources. we have Mr. William Usher at the back there, who represents a wonderful technology that was developed in Japan, the use of microorganisms. It has been tried, it works, and yet the farmers are not using it. Why? But regenerative agriculture, to me, is making sure that there's dense, rich food accessible in our markets. How we get there, all these different professionals are going to tell us. It is being able to farm that is not only sustainable today, but that the soil, that we farm the soil. If we feed the soil will feed us, because it will feed healthy plants. And that is what we're going to try. And I hope we're all motivated. And I ask one thing, to approach with an open mind. I'm not here, and I hope nobody's here to condemn the conventional agricultural approach. They also can contribute. But there's a lot of what they have done that doesn't work that we continue doing. Einstein gave us the definition of insanity. Doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. And Belize is a resilient, we are known to be a resilient people. I think it's because we have a mixture of people. We're very, very diverse people. We're an intelligent people. We resisted, for 400 years, we resisted you British people like Mr. Fleming. We resisted. You know, we did well. We're still here. We know about resistance, but now we need to become productive. I also have a little British heritage, so. So, next up, I would like to introduce one of our important speakers today, which is Dr. Don Huber of Purdue University. Here we are.
Well, I'm honored to be here with you at this important conference, and I appreciate the hospitality that has been extended, just the opportunity to associate with like-minded people that recognize the importance of agriculture, the relationship that we have. We had a neighbor that had lost her husband 15 or 16 years earlier. She kept busy in the community, but as she got older, that wasn't possible for her to get involved a lot, and her children were very concerned about her becoming a little depressed or just lonely. Even though they would stop in and visit her, they're concerned about that loneliness building up. And one of them suggested that she needed a pet. She needed something that would give her some companionship and give her the opportunity then to also share in that area. And she took that advice very seriously and drove over to Boise to the pet store and explained her situation to the pet store owner. And he took her to the back of the room and showed her this beautiful parrot. Said, "This guy is just what you need." Said, "He'll keep you, your companion, give you companionship. He'll talk your leg off." And he said, "You'll find joy in that relationship." So she bought the parrot, took it home, came back the next day and said, "Well, he hasn't said anything to me. What do I need to do?" And the pet store owner said, "Well, parrots need to exercise as they talk." Said, "You have some stairs." So she bought the stairs, took them back, put them in the cage. Next day she came back and said, "He still hasn't said anything." The pet store owner said, "Oh, do you have a swing?" And so she bought the swing, put it in the cage, and came back the third day and said, "Well, he still hasn't said anything to me. What am I doing wrong?" And the pet store owner said, "Oh, do you have a mirror?" Said, "Parrots like to look in a mirror. They're very self-centered in that area." So she bought the mirror and put it in the cage, and she came back the fourth day with this dead parrot and said, "I don't understand." Said, "I did everything that you told me to do." And he never said anything to me until just before he killed over dead, that he mumbled something. And the pet store owner said, "Oh, well, what did he mumble? What did it sound like?" And she said, "Well, the best I can figure is, doesn't that store sell any food?" Well, it's easy for us to look at the ads in our magazines, and we can do all of those things, and we get off track, and we sometimes forget what our basic relationship and basic obligation is as farmers in agriculture, as the basic infrastructure of society, that everything that happens in agriculture conditions everything else that's going to happen in society. If you don't have enough food to eat, it takes 80 or 90% of your population just to produce the very basics of life. You're not going to be able to have doctors and school teachers, vacation time, and all of those things. It's very critical for a society to have a stable agriculture that can provide for that safe, reliable, and abundant food that it runs on. And also those other commodities then that are involved in society support. As the prophet Isaiah observed in 800 BC, that all flesh is grass. That's where we start. That's our basis for movement. Oh, we've been blessed, it's been said, with the 5 S's of production. You have those God-given things of sun and rain and temperature. We have the seed, which is the blueprint for life, and the things that we can start from that has the potential then to provide for those necessities of life. We have our soils and the abiotic environment that can support that life and that plant growth and then the animal production that we need. And then we have the science, and that's the management, where each of you comes into play. How you manage these resources becomes very important on fulfilling that responsibility to provide that nutrient-dense and safe food for us. Quite often we have a problem that will pop up and we look for silver bullets. We forget that it's an integrated system. It's kind of like the guy that was sent out to drain the swamp. When he saw the alligator, he focused on it and forgot that the overall mission was to drain the swamp, which would take care of the alligator. But in that process, as we have focused on silver bullets and become accustomed to silver bullets in the chemical industry for solving all of our problems, we forget that there's a management aspect, there's a science aspect, and an application aspect that needs to bring all those things together so we don't get off track. And what we find now is that we have sick soils, we have a vanishing ecological support, we have a deteriorating crop and animal health, and we have an increase in human health and health problems. So that you're here to move that system back into that integrated process, because farming is really managing an ecology. That ecology consists of the plant, of the abiotic or the physical environment, a very dynamic biological environment that is critical to our production. To have that biology, when you have an acre of soil, you're stepping on about 10 to 20 ton of living matter, of microorganisms that are all in that soil to support, again, the plant. And then we have, of course, the pests and the diseases, and some of those stress factors that come in, so that our objective in agriculture as we manage this ecology is to make everything support the plant to the best that we can, to provide a full sufficiency in nutrients and environmental opportunities for the plant, and to make them as least conducive for the pests and stresses that come into play. And all of those stresses, all of those systems involve around nutrition. Doesn't matter whether it's cold temperatures or hot temperatures or drought or providing that full sufficiency is the objective. And if we will remember that and focus on those nutrient relationships, then we can produce that high quality, very productive and abundant food that society needs. And so we know that there are the 17 essential elements and 3 beneficial elements, but they're all conditioned upon the management of that ecology that we call farming. We have some tools to do that with. All of these are tools that will improve the nutritional status of the plant to meet its needs and its ability to use those nutrients for our production. We can employ those tools, but we need to remember that when you change one thing, you change all 4 of those components in this ecology that we call agriculture that we're managing. So that you can't change one thing without changing the interaction of all 4 of those factors that we're managing, because they're all interrelated then with nutrition. Again, the objective of growing our crops is to capture the sun's energy and to store it as sugar. Do that through a process referred to as photosynthesis. Very marvelous process of taking the carbon dioxide from the air, combining it with the hydrogen that's split off of water with manganese, that then can be combined with the carbon dioxide to form the sugar, and with some nitrogen fixation from the air, that we combine that then with the carbohydrate from the sugars that are produced, and we have our protein, our enzymes, and those engines that are working, so that we do this in 2 stages. When the plant is growing, it really becomes the factory that we have for managing or for operating that photosynthetic process. We build the factory during the vegetative growth of the plant. And then as we achieve that factory, as it reaches its more mature vegetative stage, then it goes into the reproductive stage. That's the storage stage. That's where we're storing this energy from the sun as sugar or as protein and other entities. So that we have that those 2 stages, and those 2 stages are manipulated through our management, through nutrition, again, and through using those tools that influence nutrition. Well, the seed is the blessing that we have as far as the potential to meet those needs, and the seed is also should contain all of the nutrients that it requires, that seed requires for establishment and to become independent as an entity as this factory grows. What we're finding more and more all the time is that our seeds don't have the necessary nutrients. If you have maize and it doesn't have an adequacy of zinc or manganese in that seed, in 27 days, you'll have a yield loss that will never be fully recovered, even though you provide all of those nutrients at a later stage. You've already compromised part of the potential of that seed that you took care in planting because those nutrients may not be there. That's the potential that we have, very tremendous potential in our current cultivated crops. It's estimated that we're only harvesting about 25 to 30% of the genetic potential in any of that seed. And one of our biochemical geneticists at Purdue was asked what the genetic potential of maize is as far as bushels per acre and quality bushels. He did the calculations on the chemistry, on the ribisco and pep carboxylase and the other enzymes that are involved in that capturing the sun's energy and storing it as sugar. And he calculated that on maize that it has the genetic potential for 1,100 bushels per acre. Now, at the time, we were really looking at a good maize crop in Indiana and the Midwest of being about 250 bushels. That we've been able to get a little more potential out of it now, so that we're up to about 300 to 325 bushel. My neighbor in Idaho produced 356 bushel with 20% losses from Goss's wilt. And so we're still far from the genetic potential of any of our crops as far as what we can produce if we can get this system that we call photosynthesis carried all the way through. We need the nutrition. As I mentioned, manganese is involved in the water splitting reaction. Some people would say, well, can't you get hydrogen from the air or from methane? Well, it's not in an available form for the enzymes to work in the photosystems for it to form that sugar. The way it comes is the manganese is critical for splitting the water. The hydrogen goes to the carbon dioxide to form the sugar, and the oxygen is what we get then to breathe. If you look at Barnett's old picture of him sitting at his desk at Cornell as a plant physiologist and agronomist, and behind his desk he had this huge picture of a Buddha god that he named manganese. And he said, and it showed the rest of the world population all bowing down to this god that he had called manganese. And when he was asked, he said, no, if it wasn't for manganese, there wouldn't be any oxygen, because manganese is a critical cofactor to split the water so that you have that hydrogen as a reducing agent to tie with combine with the carbon dioxide, produce it. Well, you also have then the magnesium that is a component of the chlorophyll that captures the sun's energy and provides that energy to drive this reaction with the various enzymes. And then you have all of the other nutrients that are required for this factory to work efficiently and to give you that storage of the sun's energy, again, as sugar and protein. Now, if you were one of my graduate students, you would be able to recall all of those steps in this picture, but just to show you, there are many processes that are involved chemically and physiologically in this process we call photosynthesis to bring that capacity for storage about. But all of those nutrients are required and have very critical components. So we may focus on one mineral or another mineral in the process, but we need to realize that we need the balance. We're managing an ecology, and although many of our situations we will have availability of most of these nutrients. There will be some of those nutrients that we need to add either in general or at specific times during the growth of the plant. And we'll discuss those in the next 2 days, how we optimize this system. The nutrients are required because they're part of the plant components, part of the cell wall. Your zinc and your boron determine the permeability of that cell wall and the stability of it, how it can maintain its integrity. But they're also the regulators and the activators for the other 2,000 or 3,000 physiological processes that are going on in the plant through enzyme action. So that it's important, again, to have all of those nutrients in a balanced relationship. May be able to drive a pickup on a low tire for a while before you finally wear the tire out, or even on a flat tire and bump along for a little bit. It's not efficient. It's that balance that we're managing when we manage the ecology as farmers, as agronomists, and nutritionists. All of those nutrients are very intimately interrelated for this factory to work efficiently for us and for that storage to come about so that we can have that sun's energy then for use in various capacities. Well, there are different ways that we determine whether we have a correct balance for the plant. And that plant, or that balance will be somewhat varied depending on the particular plant that we're talking about, but we can look at the visible symptoms. When you have a visible symptom of a nutrient deficiency, it tells you that the physiology isn't working right. You're not able to support specific physiological processes. We can look at it also through soil analysis, which will tell us whether we have the potential for the nutrient that is critically short. And the other aspect we can look at is the tissue analysis, where the plant actually tells us what nutrients it's able to see in the soil. And many times you'll have iron and manganese and a lot of other nutrients that are in the soil, but they're not available. For iron and manganese, nitrogen and sulfur, you have your biological cycles. So the biology becomes a critical part of having those nutrients available, as you'll have some discussion here also at this conference. When we have inconsistent results with our fertility management, whether it's organic or whether it's inorganic, it may be because we didn't have a need for the particular nutrients that are being made available through that process. May not be provided at the time that the plant needs them or in a form that the plant needs them. For instance, the plant can only use the oxidized form of sulfur, sulfate sulfur. If we're providing organic or inorganic sulfur, it takes a while for that biology to convert it to the sulfate so that the plant can utilize it. With iron and manganese, they can only be used in the reduced form, the Mn or the Fe2 plus form. They can't use the 4 plus. The 4 plus for manganese and the 3 plus for iron are just like a piece of gravel. Now we see those relationships coming about all the time with many of our plant diseases. If you look at your scorch disease on coffee, or your T4, or any of the fusarium wilt on bananas, they all are associated with what we call a biofilm. In other words, a biologically induced film that plugs up the vascular system. Well, how does it do that? It does it by starting the precipitating, the xylella, precipitating the oxidation of manganese. It produces manganese peroxidase and the lactase enzymes, and especially when you have low zinc in your soil and available for the plant, and low copper. If you bring up the copper and the zinc, almost all of your xylella and wilt diseases disappear. The pathogen may still be there. Probably is. Probably been there for many years before, but then as the environment changes so that the oxidation of manganese in that vascular flow starts occurring, it plugs up the sieve plate, plugs up the plumbing. So the Drano that we use to clean that plumbing out is to bring our copper and our zinc levels up to prevent those enzymes that require calcium to form the calcium manganese phosphate that is the actual gravel that is plugging up the system. And so we can manage a lot of those diseases very effectively with nutrition. Spent 8 years in Guatemala and Brazil with citrus variegated chlorosis, looking for controls for it. It was introduced in about CVC in around 2000 in Brazil. They said it was going to destroy the entire industry. Well, what we did was inhibit nitrification with brachiaria grass for weed control by mulching the brachiaria grass under the tree. Gives us an ammoniacal form of nitrogen that then stimulates the manganese and the zinc organisms in the soil that make those nutrients readily available. And in 3 years, we were producing 110% of the yield that they were getting under their best conditions before the disease was introduced. The same thing with Long Long Bean. Everybody told us we were crazy to even think it could be controlled in Florida. We might as well abandon citrus. And so they went out on a heavy chainsaw massacre. Maury Boyd and several other citrus growers took the Green Book on mineral nutrition and plant disease and digested it, came up with nutrient systems that maintain that health and vigor and resistance of the plant so that the 300,000 of the 1.5 million acres that was initially in Florida, but the 300,000 that's still in production and doing well is all under a nutrient program. Everything else has been chainsawed and burned because nobody thought it could be done with nutrition. Disease is the exception, not the rule. And it's when we get that balance out of hand that we start having those concerns and those problems. Well, there are various ways that we can improve nutrition. We can, of course, amend for those nutrients that aren't available in the soil or that are deficient. We can improve the genetic potential of our crops dramatically for improved both physiological efficiency or improving the ability of them to take up more nutrients by changing the root system and the structure so that we can also change the environment to make those nutrients more readily available. We do that when we have our high pH soils and we bring that pH down so that our copper and iron and manganese and zinc especially become more available. We change the biology in most of those situations. And then we can also look at the synergistic interactions with our biology and put the biology to work for us more efficiently in the soil to with the mycorrhizae on sugarcane in Brazil, for instance, and Guatemala, to improve that mycorrhizal function in the root system, because it's responsible for most of the phosphorus, zinc, and manganese uptake. So it becomes very critical. Well, 2 weeks after we apply glyphosate as a ripening agent on sugarcane, you've destroyed the mycorrhizae. You say, well, I still got a little bit of a bump, about 0.3% bump from the ripening, because the ripening, the glyphosate accumulates in the buds, so that the buds, that energy that would grow new tillers, actually goes into energy that can be stored as sugar in the stock. And so it'll be about a 0.3% boost usually from that. But what they don't count is that you've just shot yourself in the foot, because it's that bud that you've just inhibited growth from that is responsible for your ratoon crop, for your next crop. Well, you should have a 12-inch long, or about a 30-centimeter long root on that bud before you get a shoot on sugarcane. What we see consistently where we've used glyphosate as the ripener is that we'll have a shoot 2 or 3 weeks before we get the first root out, because we've tied up the calcium and the manganese that's required for root growth, as it's chelated with the glyphosate. So that as we've replaced that practice with nutrition, using some boron, molybdenum, and manganese as a ripening agent 4 weeks before harvest, the mill that handles the Magdalena mill in Guatemala produced 31,000 ton more refined sugar. This year, the second year after changing to this program, than they did with their glyphosate check areas, because they had that second crop coming on with the full vigor and nutrients that it was needing. Also, if you high up your manganese, or you don't have it available, you end up with a sugar as the reducing sugars, fructose and dextrose, accumulating in the plant, because the plant has to have manganese to form sucrose. And so if you don't have the sucrose, if you don't have the manganese, this process can't take place, and you accumulate the glucose and fructose. Anytime that we see aphids accumulating on our plants, we say, let's get some manganese, make some manganese available so that we can get it into sucrose, because they recognize these sugars that we call the reducing sugars, but they don't recognize sucrose. These two sugars kind of wave a red flag to the aphid and say, hey, come to dinner. Sucrose doesn't do that. And you get a high fructose and dextrose when that enzyme doesn't have the manganese cofactor for it. This is some research we did in Guatemala on the sugar cane to show how quickly that systemic product moves through the plant. You can see, well, maybe you can't see, I don't know whether you can see that. Within 6 hours after the application of the glyphosate, we have more than 100 times more glyphosate in the entire stalk tissue than is required to chelate all of the unbound cations. That's your calcium, potassium, manganese, magnesium, copper, zinc. Very quickly. It will peak at about 4 days. And that accumulation, then it drops off for about 4 days. But then, I apologize here, you can't see this probably, but you see in that 6-hour process, you've already depleted, they're already tied up physiologically. 90 to 95% of your iron and manganese, and about 30% of your zinc that's all required for that factory to run. You've essentially fired your workers in that capacity as far as operating this factory that's a phenomenal entity to work there. Now, when you tie up zinc, you have a very leaky cell. And it doesn't matter what the plant is, whether it's wheat or cotton or almond tree. On a zinc deficiency, you lose your amino acids and your sugar and your phenolic compounds that should be going into the plant. They're leaking out the root. The root's a very leaky entity to start with. That's what feeds your biology, but you're losing all of that. You can see what the content is here. Here's under zinc deficiency, and where that deficiency has been met, you see the loss of energy that you should be storing as sugar that is just flowing out the root system. Well, when you have that high a flow rate of all those nutrients, it also attracts some of the pathogens. Phytophthora and Pythium. A lot of those organisms are dormant until they receive extra nutrition. That nutrition then comes through those root exudates. The same thing with Fusarium. In those diseases, it's kept in a dormant state by bacteria that colonize the chlamydospores, the resting spores of the fungus. When they have all of that nutrition coming from the leaky root system, the bacteria that keep that spore from germinating are no longer required to rely on the exudates from the spore, and so they take off for these more favorable nutrients. And you have germination then of the spores, and you have very serious disease pressure then that can develop because of that imbalance in the overall system. Had an interesting system studied in Guatemala, where they had a root borer, and very serious on their bananas. They drenched the soil in the plantation, then with a good insecticide took care of the root borer, but they ended up with these beautiful bananas, but none of them, or very few of them, could be shipped because they're going all different directions. And so you get all that mechanical damage in shipping. Couldn't understand what they'd done that created that change. They were still that 1 1/4 inch diameter banana, and all of them over 5 inches, really prime bananas, but they were going all different directions in the bunch. It took a while, but finally figured out, this is an auxin response, a plant hormone response. Well, where'd all the auxin come from? Turns out that the drench stimulates the pseudomonad bacteria in the soil and provides the conditions that they produce the auxin that then the plant takes up, and you end up with this problem with that high excess auxin concentration. Again, just to point out that this ecology that we manage is a very integrated relationship between the physical and the biological environment and that plant that we want to support. And so as we look at mineral deficiencies, we see that many times that nutrient deficiency is expressed as increased disease. And if you have any of these diseases, these are some of the minerals that are critical in that resistance mechanism for the plant or for the biology of the microorganisms. And when I was in the Netherlands, had a grower, huge greenhouse production for Europe, and he asked me if I'd come and visit his greenhouse operation. As soon as I walked in the door, looked over at his peppers on the one side and his tomatoes on the other, and I said, "You have a really severe deficiency of manganese." And he said, "Well, I don't see the deficiency." He said, "I'm not seeing that intervenal chlorosis and green veins that we associate with manganese deficiency." I said, "No, you don't see those, but you can see your verticillium wilt, because there's not enough manganese to keep the phenolic levels up to suppress the extracellular enzymes of the fungus." And so he was losing 15 or 20% of his greenhouse crops to verticillium wilt. The next year, when I went back, he had 0, because he started managing and recognizing what that disease was, why that disease had exploded on him. That's the CVC. When Shoshi Yamada put together the international group of us to help control CVC in Brazil at Piracicaba, Sao Paulo. There, first thing we looked at, boy, you got extreme manganese and zinc deficiency. We started saying, well, let's see if we can apply and make some foliar applications. We applied the foliar manganese and zinc. Trees greened up for about a month, and they went back into decline. We couldn't sustain it unless we were out there all the time force feeding that plant with the manganese and zinc that it needed. The plumbing was all plugged up. We needed to have a way to clear that. As I mentioned, we went with the brachiaria grass for weed control, so that we could replace the glyphosate, which stimulates the manganese oxidizing organisms, to make it less available in the soil. We needed to suppress those organisms and needed to stimulate the manganese reducing organisms, those that would keep it in the Mn2+ form, and also increase the zinc uptake. So that we went with the brachiaria grass or several others. We could look at Trachypogon, any climax ecosystem plant, whether it's a hardwood or a conifer or an herbaceous plant. One characteristic is that they inhibit nitrification, so you have an ammonium source of nitrogen rather than a nitrate. And that, in 1 year, restored the nutrient balance then in those trees, and in 3 years we were at 110% of the production that they'd had before CVC was introduced. Now that 10% probably came because we were also controlling the Phytophthora crown rot that we hadn't recognized as being a real serious problem, but it also took care of it. When we get too much of a good thing, as you see here with, this is with take all, see those plants that are dead, black roots, no root system, they just kind of almost overnight, as they say in Australia, they call it hay dye, because the plant will make it up to the vegetative stage, up to flowering, and then it looks like it just dries off, dies overnight on them. That's because it has that extra demand for nutrients and for moisture. It can't meet it because so much of the root system is destroyed. So what happened here was you had the neighbor's dairy cows that got out on my research plot during the winter, left a signature on top of some of those plants, completely threw that nutrient balance out. We would normally say we'll get some nitrogen out to reduce take-all, nitrogen and manganese. What happens when you get too much of a good thing, though, is that you stimulate the oxidative organisms, and if you could see those under the manure pile and those just a short distance away, the difference in that population, to explain why you had kind of an opposite response of what you might anticipate with this particular disease. But with manganese, from a pH 5.2 to 7.8, for most plants, it's 100% determined by the activity of those organisms in the root system. The pH effect that you see is from the effect on the bacteria, not the direct effect, chemical effect on the manganese itself. Now you get below that or above that, then you have the redox reactions. But there are various application strategies that we can use then to improve our nutrient sufficiency, to improve that those conditions optimum for the plant that we're growing then, and we have a lot of tools available for us. We'll recognize how they fit in and then make them select those tools that fit our farming program. And in summary, I'll just state that as we fulfill our responsibilities in agriculture as the basic infrastructure of society, we must ensure that our food is a source of health rather than a cause of disease. To do this, our produce must be nutrient-dense, abundantly available, and pesticide-free. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and the opportunity to interact more with you here in the next 2 days. So, many thanks.
Thank you very much. On Boxing Day, there's a big horse race coming up. I have a horse that's running in that race. His name is Better Must Come because he's not doing well right now. But I should probably call him manganese because that's the key to success apparently. Definitely not glyphosate. So we would like to welcome now our next speaker is Mr. Rolando Butch. Is he here? Come up, sir. That might have sounded complicated, but it really isn't. If you look at the summary, it says, to fulfill these responsibilities, at the bottom it says, nutrient-dense, abundantly available, and pesticide-free. The key is pesticide-free. That's the key. Everything else, that's what the gurus are here for. They'll show us what to do. We just have to follow. Apply magnesium too. Sure.
Yes. My question, Dr. Huber, is when you apply these nutrient-rich substances, in what form is it? Is it fortified dirt or pure minerals, or what form?
You can use a lot of different minerals. It depends on what they're, again, the form would be the valent state, the chemical form, so that it was available for the plant. If you're using raw rock phosphate, which is very common in organic, we need to pulverize that, make it very small because for the plant to be able to take it up and for the organisms to act on it as quickly as possible. For manganese and for phosphorus, the nutrient has to be within 2 millimeters of the root, or the plant can't see it, can't find it. So that it doesn't matter whether it's organic or most of them inorganic, they can both serve the function if they're soluble and if they're available in the right valent state for the plant.
Now, once again, my agriculture comes from the tropics. If you ask me about American agriculture, I'll just tell you I don't know. But I do know about tropical agriculture and the sort of agriculture that people have here in Belize. And they are different. In fact, we spent 12 years at one point in the 1980s trying to find out what kind of agriculture works better in the tropics, because a lot of the stuff we were reading out of textbooks that had been translated into Spanish from the United States was either useless or totally counterproductive. Okay? So, and the interesting thing that came out of that, I'll go ahead and move into a little bit of what I'm going to say here. The interesting thing that came out of that was we came up with 5 rules, which will be familiar to most of you. Keep the soil covered, use as little tillage as absolutely, the least amount necessary, maximize the biomass production, and so forth. About 5 years after we'd already started publishing this in different books and magazines and all that sort of thing, and people were starting to adopt it and so forth. So anyway, we were in this meeting and we were realizing, we were talking about how these different principles really formed a wonderful symbiosis. In other words, if you produce a tremendous amount of biomass and you don't plow, then you're going to have cover automatically. You're going to have all this organic matter sitting on the soil. And all of a sudden, one of the people, I forget who, in the group said, "My gosh, all we've done is describe the tropical forest." And so one of our principles to this day is imitate the tropical forest. And frankly, that does a tremendous lot, not only to increase fertility, but to maintain soil quality, maintain organic matter content in the soil, and what we've learned in the last 5 years in Africa, working in drought-prone areas almost exclusively, forests never really suffer from droughts. Okay? We have found that by using these techniques that are very simple, in fact, they're cheaper than any other kind of agriculture I know of, and simpler, very easy for smallholder farmers to use, we can reduce the impact of droughts by at least 80%. Okay? In other words, in the fields where farmers have been using these techniques for at least 5 or 6 years so that we've built up the organic matter content of the soil, we're finding that in a bad year, when everybody else has got maize like this and basically has lost 80 or 90% of their productivity, our farmers are getting 80% of what they get in a good year, which is already 3 times more than most other farmers traditionally were getting. In other words, we'll raise farmers' yields from 1 ton per hectare of maize to 3 tons per hectare of maize. And 1 ton per hectare of maize, I would guess, is average among smallholder farmers here, more or less. I mean, that's the case in Guatemala and Honduras and other countries I've worked here in Central America. Yeah, that's good. Well, it's almost there, but that's much, much better, yes. Can everybody see, can you read what's written there and so forth? And can you see more or less what the picture is? Okay. Anyway, these farmers that had been using these systems and they're different systems. They're using different species. They're all green manure cover crops, but they're different species. In one case, it's Gliricidia with lab, in another case it's Carnavalia ensiformis, so jack bean. In other cases it was a whole series of native species that people in the Dogon area of Mali had just developed on their own. About 6 or 8 different food crops plus native trees that they had developed into a system that was working beautifully, and they were taking home bumper harvests when everybody else had lost their crops completely to droughts. And then in Zambia, the work was a result of an NGO where they were using entirely just Gliricidia, but using it not only as a tree, but as an alley crop. So all sorts of different species can be used, but if we're doing it right, we can get usually we can go from 1 ton to 3 tons of maize very easily in a period of 3 or 4 or 5 years. And in 6 years, we can have them getting 2.5 tons instead of 3 tons. So they've lost 20%. But during a bad drought, they will still get 2.5 tons of maize per hectare. Okay, so they're getting 80% of what they do even in the good years. And the other farmers have basically almost entirely lost their crops. I mean, they'll get maybe 1 or 2 bags of maize per hectare or something, because of the drought. Okay, the use of green manure cover crops. We use the term green manure cover crops to include trees, climbing plants, crawling plants. We use almost entirely legumes. The Brazilians, who frankly know more about green manure cover crops for large and medium-sized farmers, way more. I mean, if some of you want to have somebody come here and talk to large-scale farmers and medium-scale farmers, I can recommend 2 or 3 people from Brazil that I know quite well. I've learned a tremendous lot from them, but but we have had to learn to adapt that to what smallholder farmers need and are capable of doing. Smallholder farmers can't afford the urea that you need if you're using non-leguminous green manure cover crops. So we work almost entirely with leguminous plants that will take care of the nitrogen problem. And by the way, the nitrogen fixation of these plants is rather incredible. Jack bean that I just mentioned will produce up to 240 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. That's the equivalent of about, what, 12 sacks of urea will produce? Nobody ever puts 12 sacks of urea on 1 hectare, right? So, I mean, you know, we can definitely take care of the nitrogen. In fact, we do a number of things that, you know, if you read the scientific text, they'll say, well, you know, if you're going to use something as a green manure, you have to leave the seed on it because otherwise you're going to be losing nitrogen. Or you have to bury it. Well, smallholder farmers can't bury a whole hectare of green manure. It's impossible. It's way too much labor. So we have them leave it on top. Sure, we may lose 20, 30% of our nitrogen through volatilization. Who cares? We've got 3 times as much as we need. Okay? So it is a different world. It's a different way of doing things, and that's what we'll talk about a little today. Now, while I'm at that, let me just say that, well, I left my briefcase, that I teach 2-week courses on the subject that I'm going to try and do in half an hour right now. There's a lot more to this than I can ever say in half an hour. So if you really want to practice this and learn how to do it, I have some books, some copies of a book that I've written called Restoring the Soil, and I can sell them to you. And that will give you everything we knew about green manure cover crops until about 3 months ago when it came out. We've learned a lot since then, but that's just the way it is. Okay, the use of green manure cover crops to fertilize the soil and end the droughts. Now, people who have heard about green manures and read about them in textbooks, that's not what we're doing. Okay, we're doing something very different. In fact, the colonial powers in Africa and Latin America and elsewhere tried using green manures in the way that they're used in Europe and the United States. And the literature says that they failed completely. It didn't work. So what we decided to do when we began realizing that what organic matter was capable of doing in the soil, we realized that we had to manage it differently if smallholder farmers were going to use them. So when I talk about green manure cover crops, I'm not talking about taking a plant, putting in somebody's field, and growing it as a monocrop for 2 or 3 months, you know, wasting basically for their food crops half the growing season, and then burying it, which small farmers can't do because they don't have tractors. We're talking about a very, very different system, which is much, much better for smallholder farmers in the tropics. Most of the time, once in a while we use rotations. Most of the time we intercrop our green manures with people's maize, for instance. That way they have no transition period. They don't go through a period when, you know, they have less maize because they couldn't plant it during the first 3 months because they were growing their green manure then. No, they plant their maize the same time. And unless we have a rather bad drought the very first year, they're going to get as good a harvest of maize with the legumes intercropped in there as they do without them. Okay, or at least within 5, we don't worry about things like 5% this or 5% that because smallholder farmers can't detect that anyway. Okay, the use of green manure cover crops to fertilize the soil and end the droughts. Okay? And right now, I understand that the farmers are very worried about droughts here. In Africa, finally, the last 2 or 3 years, farmers are realizing the droughts are getting worse and worse, and they aren't going to get better. See, traditional droughts that were caused by rainfall, lack of rainfall, were self-terminating. Okay? You know, when the first good rain came again, the drought was over. You could send your relief food somewhere else, and, you know, it was the problem solved. That ain't going to happen this time, and it's not going to happen here probably. If I understand the situation here, if it's like it is in about 60% of Africa, the more drought-prone areas of Africa, going all clear across the Sahel, all down the eastern Africa, and back across through Namibia and Malawi and Zambia and so forth, you'll find that these aren't self-terminating. They're going to go on and get worse until we do something about it. That's the bad news. The good news is that when it was just a case of changing rainfall, there wasn't a whole lot we could do about it. Certainly not small-scale farmers. But there is something we can do about droughts now that we understand, and that most of the droughts are being caused by the lack of organic matter in the soil. Okay? We can put more organic matter in the soil. Now, why don't we use compost or animal manure? If we use compost, it takes a tremendous amount of organic matter to do this. By and large, the systems that add about 20 to 25 tons of organic matter per hectare green weight. Now, we're not talking about dry weight. I don't have a lab to dry stuff out, nor do the farmers, so we talk green weight. But you need 20 to 25 tons green weight to increase the fertility, well, just to maintain the fertility of your soil. If you want to increase it, you got to have more than that. Now, how many of you ever known a smallholder farmer that produced even 10 tons of compost in 1 year? Raise your hands. 5 tons? Maybe a few. I've known a few that produce 5 tons. You know, thinking they're ever going to produce 25 tons per hectare is we're dreaming. Okay, it's not going to happen. What about animal manure? Well, to fertilize a hectare of land to the point that you're just maintaining soil fertility, not even increasing it yet, just maintaining it, it takes all the manure of about 7 or 8 adult, well-fed cattle. Okay? Now, if you got 2 hectares or a small farmer, let's say has 1.5 hectares, that's about the average in Africa, that means he's got to have, or she has to have 10 to 12 tons of, 10 to 12 well-fed cattle. No longer a poor farmer as far as I'm concerned. Okay? We're working with farmers that are lucky if they have 2 animals or 3 animals. Okay? So for the vast majority of smallholder farmers around the world, if we're going to increase their agricultural, their small grain, basic grains production. Now, vegetables on a small plot near the house, sure, you can do compost. In fact, it's wonderful. I would recommend it. But if you're talking about people's grain fields, you can forget compost and you can forget animal manure. Green manure cover crops is the only way to do it. Okay? In any kind of a way that's economic. And by the way, I don't have it written here, but one other very important issue here is that people can grow green manure cover crops using most of the systems. Now, we have over 100 species of green manures that we're using, not counting the trees. There's a tremendous richness out there in the world of plants that will fertilize the soil, and most of these will also produce food for people. High protein food that the legumes produce. There's a tremendous richness. I mean, we thought when we started out, maybe in 1983, working with green manure cover crops, that maybe we'd find 5 or 6 species that would work really well. Well, think again, bunch. Right now, smallholder farmers somewhere in the world are using over 100 different species of green manure cover crops. In Brazil alone, they use over 40 species of green manure cover crops quite widely. Okay? So there's a tremendous wealth, and that's one of the things that we need to learn. The most important thing we need to learn is which of these species can be used in which kind of systems, in which environment. And by environment, I don't mean just, you know, the climate and the soil quality and so forth, but also what markets are there for some of these plants? What are the beans or peas that people are willing to eat, like to eat? Do they eat leaves? For instance, the lab bean has leaves on it that will that first of all have about 21% protein. In other words, the leaves on the lab bean have more protein than the beans that we eat, the grain. Okay? Now, this is a nutritionist dream. Not only do they have a tremendous amount of protein, they also have vitamins and minerals because they're dark green leaves. They also can be dried and stored in a fertilizer sack for 12 months, which means you have a year-round supply of proteins and a high amount of proteins. Furthermore, they're a free byproduct of producing the grain. So you have a free, year-long, high-protein, high-vitamin and mineral food that costs people nothing. I mean, this is the sort of thing we're talking about. You know, the benefits of some of these plants is just mind-boggling. Okay, to fertilize soil and end the droughts. Okay, the causes of the droughts, I already went through this. First of all, climate change is definitely a factor, especially in terms of irregularity and unpredictability of rains, and that's very important when farmers don't know when they can plant. I mean, I started working in agriculture back in the 60s when almost everywhere in the world that I went, and I'd been doing a lot of traveling for a long time, people planted by the calendar. Smallholder farmers planted by the calendar. How many of you know any smallholder farmers now that plant by the calendar? Okay, well, oh, really? Okay. Oh, okay. Do they have irrigation or what? Oh, okay, they're still following. Okay, okay, okay. Now that's a very, very important point. And I guess I'll get into it right away. Okay, number 2, much more important than climate change, the end of fallowing, or slash and burn agriculture, has dramatically reduced the quantity of organic matter in the soil. This, in other words, all over Africa, and I think it's probably true in most of Latin America, smallholder farmers who, when they were fallowing, had 3 to 4% soil organic matter are now down to less than 1%. Okay? Now, what's that mean? That means the soil, unless it's a real sandy soil, gets very hard. Research in Malawi has found that this reduction in organic matter reduces the rainwater infiltration rate from about 60%. And this is what farmers in Africa were experiencing for 3,000 years while they fallowed, you know, up until the 1980s approximately, when population pressure came to the point where they had to have less and less land, and you get down to a hectare or a hectare and a half of land, and you can't leave 3/4 of it in forest. So you have to reduce the amount of fallowing you do. And right now in Africa, fallowing is in its death throes. It's finished. I mean, there are very few places where people fallow anymore. I'm glad to hear that there's still places in Belize. Okay. What this means is that with that reduction in organic matter, the rainwater infiltration rate, as I said, goes from 60% to somewhere between 10 and 20%. And that comes from scientific experiments done in Malawi. Okay, what happens then? 80% of your water or 90% of your water is running off. In fact, farmers in a couple of African countries will often ask me, you know, what's happening? Are we getting too much rain or too little rain? You know, about every other year now we're getting droughts, and those same years we have floods. So, you know, is it too much rain or too little rain? And I'll say, well, when it rains really hard, how deep does your soil get wet? You know, if it rains for 3 or 4 hours really hard, and they'll say, oh, about that deep. You know, it used to be a lot more, but, you know, now it's like that. So where's all the rest of the water go? Oh, it runs off. And then I'll just stand there for a minute, and they'll say, oh, okay, I understand. Okay. This is very likely here in Belize. It certainly is in about 60% of all of Africa, the real problem in terms of droughts. Okay, what can be done? The only feasible solution for increasing the organic matter of our fields enough to make a difference in our fields of basic grains is to use green manure cover crops. Why? We already talked about this. Smallholder farmers do not have enough animal manure to do this, and making enough compost would take months, even if they could acquire enough plant material. And of course, all that plant material is coming from what the animals usually eat. So, you know, if you're doing compost, you're robbing your animals at the same time that you're hopefully, well, probably not really improving your soil yet. With green manure cover crops, you can not only improve your soil, but usually there's quite a bit of foliage that you can also feed your animals with. So you're increasing the animals' well-being. Green manure cover crops, on the other hand, can produce more than 50 tons per hectare per year. Once again, we're talking green weight of organic matter. That's way over the 25 I was talking about, see? Okay. For instance, lab that I just mentioned, it'll go up to 60 tons per hectare. Mukuna will go up to 70 tons per hectare. Most of our green manure cover crops, however, only produce about 50 tons per hectare per year of organic matter. Okay, what large, and I wish we had a better, we could control the light here so you could see what's happening in this photo. But you probably just have to take my word for it. Those of you who are in the front row may be able to see it. There's some maize plants here where these arrows are. And then you have another row of maize that's about this tall and a little bit yellowish. And then you have the rest of the maize field that is about 2 meters tall and dark green. Okay? Now what happened here? A farmer in Honduras didn't believe what we were saying about organic matter, and we didn't even have any idea really of what organic matter was capable of. You won't get it from US textbooks, I'll tell you. Okay? I once went through looked for all the beginning textbooks in soils in the Cornell's Mann Library, which is one of the 2 or 3 best agricultural libraries in the United States. I found 15 beginning textbooks on soils. Every single one of them had a fertilizer company official as one of the co-authors or the main author. Okay? Now, they aren't going to tell you that green manures can take over for chemical fertilizer to a large extent. Okay? So we're getting biased information. Okay, I frankly didn't believe this when I first saw it. But anyway, what happened? A farmer by the name of Conrado Zavala decided we were exaggerating what we were saying about organic matter. So he went and made 16 compost heaps, piled it on the left side of the field there, and left 2 rows without any compost. Okay, and this was a degraded field. Okay? So the only difference between the row on the right that's about ankle high and didn't produce a single grain of maize, and the one on the left that produced about 4 tons per hectare, the only difference is that on the left, Conrado turned over the soil and buried a lot of compost in it. Tremendous amount of compost, far more than is economically profitable. He never did this again, by the way, because he spent so much time and effort, you know, making all that compost that it didn't pay for the increase in yields, even though the yield increase here is dramatic, to say the least. Okay? He didn't show us this field until the day he was so embarrassed by how much he'd proven himself wrong that he didn't show us the field until other farmers started telling us about it. And I mean, this was the best field anywhere around in Huinope, Honduras, anywhere in sight. So finally we heard about it. We asked him if we could come out and see it, and he said, yeah, okay. The ankle-high maize and the 2-meter-tall maize was planted on the same day with the same seed. Same treatment except for the turning over the soil in order to put the compost in. Okay? I didn't believe it. I went around and asked some of his neighbors, and they said, yeah, he's telling the truth. That's what happened. Okay? So we began realizing that organic matter has power, much, much greater potential than anything we had ever read about. Okay? And I mean bar none. I still haven't seen a textbook that talks about this kind of a phenomenon, going from basically 0 production to 4 tons per hectare with nothing but burying organic matter. Okay? Now, there's a couple of things that this showed us beyond just the incredible power of organic matter. One is it takes a tremendous amount of organic matter to do this. You can't just do it with, you know, a few handfuls of compost on each plant or something. I mean, you know, we're talking big time organic matter inputs. The second thing is, well, actually this is related to that. The first thing I always think when I see something like this, something really, you know, wonderful, is, well, why aren't farmers already doing this? Smallholder farmers aren't dumb. I worked with them for 50 years, and I know they aren't dumb. So, you know, lots of farmers would have discovered that just putting organic matter on the soil would improve their crops. Why aren't they doing it? It's because it's anti-economic. they spend more effort making the compost or collecting the animal manure and having animals in the first place than they'll ever get in terms of increased yields. So the problem of soil fertility, by and large, now when you get really, really high productivity, when you get up 6, 8 tons or something like that, then what we were hearing today earlier is true. There can be very small micronutrient deficiencies that cause a problem. But when we're talking with smallholder farmers, they're only producing 1 ton now, and we want to get them up to 3, 4, or even 5 tons per hectare. We don't have to worry about those sorts of things. All we need to do is get enough biodiverse biomass into the soil. Okay? The manganese will take care of itself. The magnesium will take care of itself. And in Africa, where the chemical companies have been saying for 30 years now that within 15 years we were going to have a phosphorus crisis, it's even true there. And I'll tell you why I think that is. It sounds strange, but we have no problem with phosphorus even after 25 or 30 years of using green manure cover crops. And in fact, there are traditional systems right here in Central America, like the maize mucuna system. Farmers have been using it for 40 years on soils that used to be phosphorus deficient. And after 40 years, they're getting 3, 4 tons per hectare year after year after year, and they still don't have a phosphorus deficiency. In fact, a young student from Cornell doing his doctorate degree actually tried applying phosphorus and got no response. A long ways from having a phosphorus deficiency. Okay? Nitrogen is the issue. Nitrogen is the one big issue we have to deal with, and that's why we always use legumes. Okay? In fact, to a large extent, the amount of increase you get from these green manure cover crops will be very, very closely related to the amount of nitrogen that the particular species you are using, and species, I mean several species, are capable of fixing. Okay? By the way, if there are any questions, doubts, or whatever, bring them up at the time. If we run out of time, then I'll tell you, well, we can't have any more questions. But if you have questions right now, please bring them up. That's perfectly fine. In fact, it works better if we're looking at the photo rather than later on everybody's trying to remember now which photo was that. Yeah. Okay, that's a very good question, and there's a lot of discussion about that. Our experience is that most smallholder farmers can't get a hold of inoculant. It doesn't even exist in the nearest town. They'd have to go to the capital city of the country in many cases. Secondly, an awful lot of smallholder farmers have more patience than money. So what you can do is you can plant. For instance, in the case, we've done this with lab beans because we use lab beans a lot in areas where people already eat it. It's actually an East African bean. We didn't know this until a few years ago. And so it's native to the area. So there are pockets of people all across Eastern Africa that eat lab beans. Do most of you know what lab beans are? Okay, well, it's a little round. It looks like a pea. I'll show you some plants of it a little later. But it's a wonderful little plant. What was your question again? Yes, okay. In areas where we wanted to use the lab bean, we've taken 2 approaches. One is we plant lab knowing that it's not going to produce very well, but the presence of the roots will increase the rhizobium in the soil that live on lab. So by the second year, you don't have a problem of inoculating. So most farmers, I mean, we can tell them if we know there's some inoculum somewhere in the country, we can tell them that there's an inoculum, and then that way they could get a good lab crop the first year. But they usually prefer just, we'll just plant it, and even if it doesn't grow very well, by the second year, our soil will basically be inoculated. Now the other thing, and I'm not sure why this works, but by planting jack bean, which I don't think the rhizobium of the 2 species are the same, but for some reason because the jack bean does increase the organic matter content of the soil and the nitrogen content of the soil dramatically, I think what happens is that all sorts of microorganisms increase in numbers because they have something to eat. You know, once you you know, have that level of organic matter going onto the soil, all these microorganisms have enough to eat, and including the rhizobium. I'm not sure about that. I don't know what's going on, but we do know that after 1 year of jack bean, or in a few cases 2 years, when you started out with a totally ratted out soil, you know, a complete wasteland where nothing would grow, it may take 2 years, but then you can grow lab beans and they'll do very well. So we very rarely use inoculum, even here in Central America, where it, you know, is a little bit more available. But usually farmers would prefer to just, you know, spend another year waiting rather than spending the money. Yeah. No. Yes, they chop and drop. Yeah. Now, the timing of that is by far the biggest mistake farmers usually make. For instance, with pigeon peas. Most of you know what pigeon peas are? Pardon? That's right. Cajanus cajan, and the Spanish name is gandul, or in Panama, I remember they call it guandu. But yeah. Okay. In that case, usually the bean matures. There are all sorts of different varieties, and this will vary, but it usually matures about a month after the dry season has started, and something like that. So you still have, in a unimodal area like here, you still have about 5 months of dry season. And most people, when they get their harvest of gandul or of pigeon pea, they cut it down and lay it on the ground. And that means that they're losing virtually all the nitrogen. Okay? Nitrogen volatilizes. Okay? That means that if it's sitting in the hot tropical sun, now not so much in the highlands. In Guatemala and the highlands, we didn't have such a problem like this. Or Peru or Bolivia, or, you know, even Kenya or Ethiopia. But in the lowlands, it's hot enough so that about 15% of all of a plant's nitrogen is volatilized each month, which means after 6 months you've lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% of all your nitrogen. Okay? That means your plant, your green manure is basically useless, no matter how much you produced. Okay? And this is one of the biggest problems, because with a lot of smallholder farmers, there are grazing animals that are let loose during the dry season, and boy, there's nothing they like better than lab. I mean, if you want a incredibly popular food for your animals during the dry season, just try lab. There are large-scale farmers in southern Honduras that grow maize in lab. When the dry season starts, they harvest their maize. They harvest the first harvest of lab because the lab will go on producing for 6 months. But you know, they take the first harvest and sell it. Put their animals in the field, shut the gate, and don't bother about the cattle for 6 months. The cattle will eat the maize in the lab. They put the right number of cattle in there, so it'll take them all 6 months to eat the lab, and their cattle will be very, very happy. They will be getting fatter all during the dry season and producing plenty of milk and so forth and so on. When they finish it up, the rains start again. They move the cattle out, let the rains graze elsewhere, and grow lab and maize again. But the grain has 23% protein, which is better than any animal feed you can buy in a store, I think. And we've had experiments where we were trying 15 or 20 different legumes to see how they would grow in a particular area. A farmer comes and cuts the fence, lets his cattle in, and they finish up the lab before they touch anything else. Okay? And animals can smell it from, I don't know, at least 300 or 400 meters away. I mean, we've had experiences in West Africa where a farmer tried it, and as soon as the rains stop and the cattle are let loose, every animal in the village is in that lab plot. And it doesn't last very long. Okay. Thank you for the questions. Okay, what are the advantages of green manure cover crops? This is just a short list. There are a lot more. because they have an incredible array of different benefits depending on the species you're using. First of all, they can triple present yields of basic grains. That's almost a given. Now, that'll take 3 or 4 years. It won't happen in 1 year. In fact, one of the problems that I'll mention a little later of green manure cover crops is that they take a while, they take at least a year, in most cases, to produce results. And smallholder farmers, they want to see the results as soon as they can. Second, these same plants can produce a large quantity of additional food rich in proteins. Okay? Some of these legumes only have 18% protein, but a lot of them go up to 20 and sometimes more than that. Okay, 3. I think I've mentioned that. Okay. 3. Some of these green manure cover crops also reduce the hunger season or totally end it. For instance, lab beans, they can grow clear through they will produce beans right up until the end of the dry season when you cut it down to plant your maize. So you're basically tremendously reducing the hunger season, as well as reducing the protein malnutrition during the hunger season. 4, they can also help reduce the labor needed to control weeds. In Africa, women do the weeding, and this is one of the most beautiful ways we have of reducing women's labor out in the fields. With many crops, maize, sorghum, millet, cassava. You only need to weed once. In other words, at the beginning of the season, the first weeds that come up, you have to control them, and then by that time the green manure is big enough so it covers the rest of them. Okay, so you only have to weed once. Cassava, sometimes you have to weed 4 times. Not anymore. Once. In fact, there's a whole area of southern Paraguay where, and I think I have a slide in here I'll have to see, but where they grow jack bean intercropped with their cassava, and they're getting 3 or 4 times the yields they ever got before they started doing that. But also, they only have to weed it once. Okay, and there are, I don't know how many, but something well over 100,000 farmers doing this. I mean, it's a whole huge area of southern Paraguay where people have adopted this system. And that's in spite of the fact that jack beans are not edible. You know, then you get something like lab or pigeon pea or some of the others that are edible, and people really go wild. I mean, this is great stuff. Okay. And that's why we don't just call them green manures, we call them green manure cover crops, because cover crops control weeds. The whole idea of cover crops is that they control weeds. So most of these species can do both. Now, a few don't. The pigeon pea doesn't control weeds very well because it lets too much light through. But that provides us with another advantage. In Malawi now they have a system that they call the doubled up legume system. So they plant maize, they intercrop their pigeon pea or gandul with the maize, and then they grow actually what they grow is usually either peanuts or soybeans underneath, and they get 3 good food crops at the same time that they're fertilizing their soil. Okay? The story gets better and better. Actually, you don't have to limit yourselves to those species. We've tried it with green grams, we've tried it with rice beans, we've tried it with cowpeas, and the same thing works. You can, under the maize and pigeon pea, you can plant some other legume and get another food crop. Now, one of the questions that always comes up is, well, now hold it just a minute. You can't intercrop and have much of an advantage out of it. Intercropping doesn't really work. Well, that's true in the cold countries or the areas outside of the tropics. I mean, I once had a little bit of an argument with the top technical officer of USAID. He was saying, well, you can't intercrop. There's no advantage to it. Well, in fact, books now, quite a number of books will say that you can get up to a 70% increase in total value of your crop by intercropping. Now, why can't we do it up here? Well, one thing is we don't have enough heat. You know, the more heat you have, the more sunlight you have, then the more you can intercrop. But another reason is one I've never seen in any book ever, but it just occurred to me one day, and it's very definitely a factor. And that is the tropics by definition, by their very definition, are areas of the world where the sun is directly overhead at some time during the year. I mean, the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn are the points at which the sun no longer goes any further away from the equator. Okay? That means that, and I'll have to put down the mic here. That means that if you have a maize crop that's this tall and a bean crop that's this tall, up here in the United States, the sun comes in like that, the maize gets all the sunlight and the bean gets nothing. Okay? If the sun's coming down more vertically, then your maize is here, your beans are here, and both of them get some sunlight because the sunlight's coming down straight. It's that simple. Yeah. Oh, excuse me. In the United States, excuse me. Okay, yeah, I got to remember this. I was in the United States yesterday. Yeah.
Be careful when you hit a crop, the cover crop, you don't overpopulate, like seed variety.
Yes. And the interesting thing is that at least in the tropics, in the lowland tropics, we haven't had a problem as much with nutrient competition as we have with water competition. Now, the first year, when our soils are still having troubles with droughts, serious troubles with droughts, we can have a loss of productivity because of what we've planted in between, because the green manure cover crop is competing with the maize. After about the second or third year, we don't have to worry about that because the drought resilience or drought resistance of the field is much improved. So what we do is we always tell farmers, for this reason and many other reasons too, we always tell farmers, okay, anything we tell you, I mean, this is one of the first things we say when we start having classes with smallholder farmers. Anything we say, try it out on a small scale first. Try it out on a 20 by 30 meter plot or whatever, whatever you want, but try it out on a small scale, because if you have a severe drought the first year, you may lose 20 or 30% of your maize crop. So don't do it on all your land. Just do it on a small piece. It's not going to hurt you. If you lose 20 or 30% of, 1/10 of your crop or 1/20 of your crop, you're losing 2%. Big deal. Okay? And then, they can do it the second year. If the second year there's a bad drought and they've increased the area, they're doing this to 4 times, sure, they might lose 20% of their crop on that 4 times as much area, but they will probably get an increase of 50% on the one they did last year because the soil's already a little better and a little more drought resistant. So they really, in most cases with green manure cover crops, there's no transition period. Like for instance, with organic agriculture or something, they always talk about a transition period of several years when you have to sort of tighten your belt a little bit. Not so with green manure cover crops. By starting out small, we can avoid that problem almost completely. Yeah. Okay. More advantages. 5, the green manure cover crops can reduce the impact of droughts by up to 80%. And now this does take 5 or 6 years, so people have to have patience. In fact, what we're doing in Africa now is doing some videos where farmers who have already gotten to that point, we can pan from a field that's looking really nice to a field that's obviously incredibly drought resistant, and ask them if they really do believe that all of a sudden the rain starts raining at this fence and stops raining at the next fence. I mean, we have some fun with those photos. And they say, well, obviously that field for some reason is not having problems with the drought. And we're also having these same farmers that have done this already give a little testimony in each of about 6 different languages, and we're using this in about 8 countries across Eastern and Southern Africa. And the initial result, we haven't done it very much yet. The initial results are that, yeah, people, because frankly, in Africa, like in Latin America, there are all these, what I feel are silly rumors that smallholder farmers don't want to change anything. My experience is that if smallholder farmers aren't making a change, and we've got to find out what we're doing wrong. I mean, either we aren't teaching them a technology that's advantageous to them, or we're not teaching it in the right way, or we're not somehow communicating with them, or something. But my experience, and I've worked among you know, Quechuas in Bolivia and Cochiquels in Guatemala and tribals in India and Thai people in Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I worked with some of the people who are considered the dumbest on the face of the earth. And if anything, we have to tell them now, be sure to try it out on a small scale. Don't do this on all your land because, you know, there might be a problem. So, you know, take it easy. Don't adopt it too fast. I mean, that's what our message usually has to be, to keep them from having problems. And I will say that very strongly because I've seen this in at least 45 or 50 different countries that I've worked in. If the farmers aren't making a change that you're recommending, then either you're recommending the wrong thing or, you know, there's something wrong. Because if it's actually, if in fact it's advantageous to the farmers according to their own cultural values, not ours, but theirs, then they will make the changes. You know, most of these farmers out here wouldn't have survived if they hadn't made changes through the years. In fact, in Africa, I have fun with agronomists that say that because I'll say, well, now that's interesting. Where did maize come from? Oh, it came from somewhere around Mexico or something like that, you know. Oh, I see. So how did it get spread clear across Africa in about 200 years after the Spanish brought it over? Well, it was small farmers teaching other small farmers when there weren't even any extension programs around. Okay? And then I'll talk about the another one of the four most important crops all over Africa, cassava. Where did it come from? And somebody in the group will have heard that, it came from the Amazon. Okay, same story. It was spread clear across Africa because farmers taught each other and they all adopted it. 3 out of the 4 most important crops in Africa were taken to Africa less than 800 years ago. Were spread across the continent by smallholder farmers, teaching each other, okay? I mean, I've worked with the Cochiquels in Guatemala. They're considered very conservative and unwilling to change. They produced about 15 or 16 different species for taking to market when we first got there in 1972, okay? Which is, you know, there would be maize and beans, of course, and squash, and, you know, they produce a little bit of coffee and sugarcane around the house, and then there's 4 or 5 herbs, traditional herbs that grow in their maize fields, etc. So you get up to about, you know, and a couple of vegetables and some sugarcane. So you get up to about 15 or 16 species that they were selling in the market. When I went back about 6 or 8 years ago, so that's, let's see, 2010, 1980, 30 years after our program ended, and our program hasn't done anything there since. 30 years after the program ended, I counted 96 locally produced species in the local market on Sunday morning. Okay? They're producing all sorts of vegetables, all sorts of fruits, all sorts of, you know, things we never even dreamed of. And we maybe introduced 3 of those during the program, okay? The rest they've developed themselves. So, you know, I believe very strongly, with a lot of evidence from all over the world, that in fact, smallholder farmers, if we teach them something in the right way and teach them something that they need according to their own traditional values, their own cultural, I should say, cultural values, they will change. And this, I'm finding this absolutely, in fact, in Africa, I'm actually shocked at how fast people are changing. Okay. Now, 6. And this, I think, is, for me personally, this is tremendously important. All organic matter is very close to 50% carbon. Okay? At least all plant organic matter is very close to 50% carbon. This means that all this carbon going to the soil, I've done calculations based on the latest scientific data about how much of this carbon is sequestered long term in the soil, because the short term stuff doesn't really make any difference. But looking at the long term sequestration of carbon in the soil, our farmers in Africa that are using, you know, a dozen different species of green manure cover crops in different situations, are most of them sequestering long term about 4 tons per hectare per year. Okay? Now, how does that compare? I mean, is that significant or not? Well, smallholder farmers in Africa, well, I'm not sure about that figure. Okay, let me put it this way. If all the farmers and all the ranchers in the world sequestered that amount of carbon, they would sequester 80% of all the carbon that needs to be sequestered by the year 2100, according to the Paris Accords. 80%. We've got the solution to carbon, or at least a big part of the solution, a huge part of the solution to global warming right under our feet. Okay? And in fact, there are now at least one, I think two of the best scientists in the IPCC, which is the organization that is looking at what's happening with global warming around the world, that have now come out and said that by far the cheapest way to sequester most of the carbon that we need to sequester by the year 2100, according to the Paris Accords, is going to have to be sequestered in the soil. Furthermore, we can sequester carbon in the soil at a far cheaper price than you can achieve by doing any other kind of carbon sequestration that I know of. Okay? I mean, I've read quite a bit about this. I've looked at all the different possibilities. We can do it for, in many cases, a fifth or a tenth of what it's going to take for people to sequester carbon in caves and shooting particles in the atmosphere and all these sorts of nonsensical things. And in fact, it's far cheaper than planting trees, afforestation or reforestation. Okay? Okay, the interesting thing is that in a natural, now I'm not sure about temperate forests, but in a tropical forest, there's more carbon in the soil than there is in the trees. That's a fact. And there is no limit. Also, some people say, well, maybe there's a limit to how much carbon you can put in the soil. The maize mucuna system right here in Honduras, Guatemala, and halfway up to Texas in Mexico is a very good example of how much carbon you can put in the soil. By the way, Could somebody tell me when we only have 5 minutes left? Because I do right now. Okay, good. Anyway, in that system, the organic matter, the topsoil is about this thick. When you walk on those soils, it feels like you're walking on a soft mattress. Okay. Now it wasn't that way 40 years ago when this system was developed, but now it's you go to any field where they don't have the mucuna and it's hard as a rock. Furthermore, I know a doctoral student from Cornell University, a friend of mine, that went down and looked at the phosphorus content of the soil and was totally shocked that they hadn't been using phosphorus for 40 years. They'd been taking off very good maize yields, 3 to 4 tons a year, and they still didn't have a phosphorus problem. So he tried adding some phosphorus to see what impact that would have. 0. He didn't even get a response to phosphorus after 40 years. Now, some of you are going to want to ask me why that is, and I'll tell you later. But it's part speculate. Part of it is just the fact that, for instance, fields aren't closed systems, so you have birds and bats constantly bringing in phosphorus and pooping it on the field. But there are a couple of other reasons that are really quite interesting. Yeah, you had a question? Oh, absolutely. With all this organic matter, the soil structure, I mean, it becomes very, very soft and pliable, and there's all sorts of, if there aren't earthworm holes, letting the water in, it's very well, I forget the term, but is it flocculated? It has, yeah, it's very well aerated. I mean, it completely changes. I mean, it becomes, well, here, I think I have a photo in just a little while that'll show you, although we won't be able to see it very well. But anyway, Yeah, so, this friend of mine from Cornell also had a soil analysis done on it. The soil analysis said 12% organic matter. 12%. Well, his professor at Cornell didn't believe him, and he was one of the world's experts on soils, Kenneth Boulding. So they tried it, they sent it to another lab, 12%. He still didn't believe it, so my friend had to put a lower figure in the thing and say more than 8%, you know. But no, there's virtually no limit. I've seen, you know, I'm sure many of you have heard the old saw that it takes 100 years to form an inch of topsoil. Well, it turns out that was if you start out with a pile of rocks. So right off the bat, it's not a very good idea of what you can do with soils. But we are finding in Africa as well as in Guatemala and Honduras that farmers that are using green manure cover crops well can usually increase the soil, the amount of dark, soft, pliable, et cetera, what we would usually call topsoil, by about 2 centimeters a year, which means they in a year and a half, well, in 3 years they can increase it by 2 inches, more or less. Okay, and that's quite widespread. Okay, let me just really finish fast here. Okay, this photo shows the improvement in fertility achieved after only 2 years through the use of only one green manure cover crop system. Now this is a particularly good example. This is not typical. This is better than usual. But you can see, this is the same photo. The woman standing there at the upper left is the owner of the field, and you can see the maize behind her is going to produce 3 or 4 times what the maize at her feet is going to produce. Okay? Now, like I say, that's better than usual. Usually it takes us about 5 years to get this kind of an increase in yields. I mean, I want to be honest with you. Okay. Now, these two photos are the 2 photos you really ought to remember out of this whole thing because they asked me to talk about droughts. This is a field in Madagascar. Again, it's a woman farmer. And you can see the green manure cover crop there is it's a year-long, or in this case, a 9-month-long cowpea, and you can see the maize. You can see the maize is heavily affected by droughts. The leaves are all rolled up. The productivity probably isn't going to be even half a ton per hectare, probably a good deal less. But if you look over here, you can see there's a green patch there in the background. Okay? She wasn't a scientist. She didn't put her 2 fields right next to each other. Nevertheless, we went over and took a picture of that field. There it is. Same drought, you know, a field a few meters away, and this is producing this is producing about 4 tons per hectare. What's the difference? And you can see a little bit of a drought problem in here. Some of the leaves are a little curled, but out here where it isn't competing with the vetiver grass, it's doing very well, thank you. What's the difference? This field has had 6 years of cowpea. The other field, it was the first year she planted the cowpea in her field. It's the only difference. Okay? That is drought resistance. Okay? And we're finding that, I've seen that now in 4 different countries very, very clearly. These, I will just say, are the nodules from one mucuna plant. Okay? Now I know in our textbooks they'll have a root like this, and about every inch or 2 inches along the root they'll have 1 millimeter in diameter little ball, and they'll tell you these are nodules. Well, they are, but that's not good, decent production of nodules. Now, in this case, the farmers were just seeing how much they could produce, so they cleared an area around that mucuna plant of about 3 meters in every direction, so it had no competition from anything. So you won't see this in a regular field. But these are the nodules produced by one mucuna plant, and in the field sometimes you'll see one of these golf balls under your plant if you dig it up at the right time of the year, okay? But, you know, mucuna fixes about 140 up to 140 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. You're not going to do that in little 1 millimeter in diameter nodules spaced an inch along each root. There's no way. The amount of nodulation that these plants can produce is way beyond what we've been told. Okay, we're going to have to forget the disadvantages. Basically, there are about 5 disadvantages of green manure cover crops, and these are the things we have to take into account and we have to learn how to avoid. Okay? The biggest one is how do we get these doggone plants through the dry season without the cattle eating them? Okay? Because we have to have green leaves on the ground when we plant our next crop. That is the biggest challenge. And there are ways to do it, but we need to learn how. Okay, and these rules come out of those. Number 1, by far the most important rule, the golden rule, is that green leaves of the green manure cover crops must be on the ground at the time the farmers plant their next crop. Okay. Farmers are not going to change their farming systems. We have to accommodate green manures to their farming systems. We have to change the green manure systems to fit their farming systems. We are trying to use more and more species. We're up to about 3 or 4 species in most fields now. The more species we have, the more biodiversity we have, and the better chance we're going to have of getting good production. And we want to imitate the forest. Okay, this is jack bean intercropped with maize. You can see about 80 or 90% of the maize died because of drought. This is in a very droughty area of Yucatan in Mexico. And about 80-90% of the maize died. The jack bean looks as if it had just been irrigated yesterday. Okay, it's extremely drought resistant and very good at recuperating soils. In 1 or 2 years, any soil, even though nothing would grow on it, even though it was a wasteland, it will produce reasonably decent crops. Okay, here's the lab bean. You can see it produces a tremendous amount of biomass. This is 2 months into the dry season, by the way. Once it's had 2 or 3 months of rain, it's very, very resistant to drought. And it'll go clear through a dry season. And it's also an excellent fodder for animals. Gliricidia. You have gliricidia all over the place here. You're lucky. In Africa, we sometimes have to go 3 countries away to get some gliricidia seed. This is what's called madriao or madre de cacao here in Central America. It is a wonderful dispersed shade, which means you're creating, you're not only reducing the temperature of your crops so that they will do better just because of the shade, not to count the leaves, these leaves are as good kilo for kilo as cow manure is for your soil, for your productivity. And furthermore, it's good fodder for animals. It will naturally produce leaves during the last 2 months of the dry season, which is precisely when your animals most need it. I mean, you can see in that photo, this is in the Sahel, there's nothing for the cattle to eat except the gliricidia leaves. It also is a long-term, okay, people talk about climate-smart agriculture, and they think, you got to do irrigation and all that sort of stuff. This is an extremely cheap way of creating climate-smart agriculture. The crops under these trees, if the ambient temperature gets hotter, you just prune fewer branches off the trees. Problem solved. These trees will keep your crops doing well for the next 100 years. Okay? And they also, of course, the shade reduces the evaporation and transpiration rates of the crops and the land underneath. It reduces the wind velocity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you're getting almost total resilience to drought. And it's also extremely fast growing, has all sorts of other advantages I don't have time to go into. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to call upon our Minister of Agriculture, Mr. Hulse, who has patiently waited, and he has provided all of these facilities for us. When he's done, we're kindly inviting everybody over to a small reception where we can gather and chit-chat and get to know each other. Mr. Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Juan. Pleasant good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's a longish afternoon, so I won't take too long. But first of all, I want to welcome you to the 2nd Annual Tropical Agricultural Conference. And we were happy to provide these facilities because this is agriculture at its best. And one of the things we aim to do in this ministry is, and we're getting there, is to create a permanent home for agriculture and the agriculture ministry, which are these showgrounds. So that future ministers are not all over the place, but they're at a place where there's agriculture and where these kinds of conferences. So this is a start. Before I get into the address, I want to recognize, I don't see him anymore, Dr. Huber. He did a wonderful presentation and excited me. Ah, there you are. Excited me with the sort of solutions to race 4 and greening in citrus, HLB. The magnesium input is interesting, and I'm sorry that some of my colleagues are not here, but I'm sure that they will get here to hear that. I want to also welcome and thank Dr. Runch from the University of California, who just finished speaking, and his input on nitrogen and that sort of thing. It is good to be here. On Friday last, we had a parliamentary forum on food and nutrition security for a healthy Belize. A parliamentary forum for food and nutrition security for a healthy Belize. Big statement that really said nothing. These were parliamentarians in Belize. Unfortunately, we had the opposition and my government representatives all there. And it was announced that I was off for a week. And so they thanked me for coming off my vacation to make a little presentation. The truth of the matter is I was not on vacation. I never took that in my life. I would not know what to do with vacation. I was at my farm because we had a lot of drought. Everything was dry and the ground was cracked up. And then we had a lot of rain. And the cows were in water to here. And the chickens were on their roosts. And everything was just mucky and messy. And my boys, as smart as they are too educated, too well-trained, too university-trained, and so are my girls, to know what to do. So, let me go and show you how we get it out, because the more important thing is drainage and how we drain and what we do and what we don't do. So I took the week to do that and get that under my belt. Because you see, first time I planted any crop, first time I was 3 years to 4 years old, and that was rice. My dad took me to his rice farm, and I was the baby. And my mom was there on a little fire heart, as we call it, cooking, and my sisters were there helping, and I was the baby. And he took me to plant rice. And so he made this hole, and he says, put 3 seeds. I just put a handful, and I put a handful. And when it sprouted, 10 days later, he goes and he says to my mom, this is a smart kid. He's a genius. He's going to become great one of these days because he put 3 seeds and 10 come up. Says, but you have to learn to follow instructions and listen. So we're going back there to take out the extra ones and leave 3. That was the saddest thing. But anyway, my mother thought it was abuse. Rough up the child. But we grew and lived on a 20-acre plot of pine ridge. No good soil. Good for nothing. In this country, you have pine ridge everywhere. Nobody wants pine ridge soil. It's acidic. Can't grow anything except cashew and blackberry. They grow wild. Not grow anything else. But on that pine ridge soil, we had watermelon, we had tomatoes, we had pineapple, we had pumpkin, we had cassava, we had cocoyam, we had the blackberry tree, of course, we had the cashew trees, we had mango, we had rice and beans and corn, and we grew pigs, and we had a couple cows, and we had a lot of chickens. So we were self-sufficient, that famous word, and we were independent. That was the important word for me coming up as a kid, because I knew that I would never be dependent on anybody, anytime, anywhere. And the Pine Ridge soil grew all of that. As my dad says, there is no bad soil. There were just poor soil managers, whatever that meant. Never knew what he was talking about. Fast forward, and that was almost 70 years ago, because that was 1950. When he died, 20 years ago roughly, just before he died, he was on his deathbed. And I had morphed into becoming an engineer and going to University of Bradford and becoming an industrial project manager and all the big words that you talk about. Mr. Fleming here knows a bunch of Indian guys that bought the farm from me. We grew 9,000 acres of rice, and we crop dusted, and we did everything you had to do like California style, and irrigated and pumped from the river 64,000 gallons of water a minute using 4 D3 5-tree Caterpillar pumps, lifting 17,000 gallons a minute each, 20-inch pumps. I was excited and happy for that because all I am is an engineer. I didn't want to do all this thing that my dad did at all because I wanted to make sure that I had technology to do any and everything in food production. And I figured, well, there are all the agronomic boys and everybody else who could do this. And then at that farm, we plowed and we killed everything that moved. And then the canal that originally started at 10 feet, it got to 24 feet because of the erosion. And anything that named fish was dead. Any animal that moved was dead. Anything. I crop dusted for hours every day. And we sprayed any chemical you can imagine. As this is commercial farming. And 9,000 acres of rice. And on those tractors, 260 horsepower tractors, 510 horsepower tractors, we hauled 60 foot of harrows behind. 3 in tandem. And all you saw was dust. Then we flooded the fields, we pre-germinated the rice, we flew it on, and it came up. Now we had a mill that produced 8 tons of rice an hour. Best in the region. $53 million of investment. Happiest man on the face of the earth. And that was rice farming. The place was called Big Falls Ranch. We produced rice that we package and we ship into the Caribbean, 25 containers a month. And we shipped into Martinique 10, and it went into France under Lomé 3. We had 4,000 head of cattle, and we shipped them into Martinique as well. And then the politics changed. From one day to the next, we could no longer ship rice, and we could no longer ship cattle. And we went dead. We went into receivership. Laid off 450 people in one day. 1982, February 17th. We had just gotten our independence a couple months before. It was a sad day. 13 million pounds of rice in silos. I don't know what to do with them. And then in September, government also did the same thing and introduced the national herd policy. And the rule was that you should have a cow per man, a cow per person in Belize per year. So since we had at that time 140,000 people, you could not export any cattle unless you had 140,000 heads. So after 4,000 heads we had, we sold 1 a month. Nonsense. But what did that do for me? The place became jungle. The bush grew up. People came to buy it from all over the world and said, look how this place is. What was once a beautiful place, what was once one of the prettiest farms in the region from California to Argentina for sure. Highly productive. Look how it looks. Jungle took over things, all the smooth fields, the levees, you couldn't find them. Pumps began to rotten, the silos began to rotten down, etc., etc. And then I discovered something fantastic. I spent 10 years in that kind of, what I would call mess, trying to sell it to everybody who would come. Englishmen, Irishmen, Venezuelans, all, but eventually we sold it to some Indian farmers. But I discovered something in that. We had a variety of rice called Cardi 70 that I had developed together with Cardi, and I recognized George from Cardi. They did the upland, and I had done the lowland varieties under Dr. Roy. And it was a beautiful variety. And of course, when we went, most all of that went to, as we said, to hell. And the farm shrunk and shrunk as the jungle grew and grew. Canals began to grow back up. There was fish again, there was wildlife, there was everything you can imagine coming back. And one day I went into one of the fields that we had leveled out completely. And the jungle was high, very high. I was walking through the field, and guess what I saw? I saw rice. This can't be right. I see rice actually growing there that we had not planted for the last maybe 15 years. Rice was growing. Then I went to another part, and I was going through, and I saw beans, red kidney beans. It's growing, and it's growing, and it's growing. And I asked myself, how the hell this is growing after 15 years in the jungle when we could not get that grow for a month unless we were dumping urea, NPK in the highest amount with a little bit of trace, etc., etc., and we were pushing it really hard. And then I discovered that, you know what? Mother Nature has a way to do her thing. And then just before my father died, which was 1990, on his deathbed, he called me, said, come here, my son. And he sat right up. And they say when you sit up when you're really sick and you sit up. That's it. Say, come here, man, come here, come here. So I want you to stop telling this lie you're telling everybody. It's a lie. He said, because you ain't growing no rice. Well, I knew he was delirious. That has got to be ridiculous. He taught me to plant this rice when I was 3, so I mean I'm not growing rice. And he asked me a few questions. He said, I ask you a question. You make the seed? Yes or no? No. You make the sunlight? Yes or no? No. You make the water? Yes or no? No. Okay. You make the air? Yes or no? No. Okay. He said, so you put God's seed at a spot that's convenient for you, and you pump his water to at a spot that's convenient for you. And that friend you have, you call Mr. Pusser, that was Junior, who had Pusser fertilizer. And he says, and he just grind up God's little stone and you put it in a bag and you put it there. He says, so what you're really doing is you managing. You the manage, you know, the grow nothing. He says, so stop tell that lie that you're going. He says, so the next time you put that seed, he says, and even that you're not doing well because you're not managing well. You're not managing the soil or nothing. He says, so the next time you do that, remember God's people get some. He said, the plant not grow for you. No, the plant is growing for itself to reproduce for all generations. God people get some. God's insects must get some. God birds must get some. God's animals must get some. And some must be left for future generation. And the amount you take off there, don't rip off anybody. And he died exactly 10 minutes later. That wiped out everything I learned at University of Munich. That wiped out everything I learned at University of Radford. Just like that. And that was regenerative agriculture. Because that's the same man who had those chickens and pigs and everything I just mentioned on Pine Ridge soil with a standard 6 education. And here I was with master's degree and engineering qualification, etc. And he just blew that right away. And what has happened to us today, ladies and gentlemen? We lost that link. That link disappeared. Disappeared with my dad. Disappeared with all the men in that period of time who could tell you what to do, how to do. We never knew the word fertilizer. The only thing we used to put is something called white lime because they used to say the soil too salty. They never even used the word acidic, too salty, and so you have to freshen it. So they put white lime. That's all we knew. Never knew about no glyphosate, never knew about no paraquat, never knew about any of that. The only chemical we ever used on the rice plot was habanero pepper ground up with some stink bugs in a little thing and strain the juice and we spray with that. You don't get no army worms, you don't get no stink bug, you don't get no nothing. Highly organic. That's all we knew. And today we can't farm unless we have everything you can name. And it just keeps coming more and more and more and more. So what I'm saying here is I moved from that to being the Minister of Agriculture, thank God, because there was only one reason. And I wanted to tell you that story first because this is the reason. You cannot legislate healthy eating and living. You cannot legislate. So you have to educate. That's all you can do. You must educate to ensure compliance because that is self-policing. Legislation, you have to police and you'll never police. So I said to the people on Friday, we are now in this ministry starting in the schools. Why the schools? Because that is the sponge mentality area where you can capture the kids. And my good staff back there teach these kids how to do it and do it right, how to eat healthy, how to live healthy, how to use 0 to no pesticides and all this sort of thing so that they get it right. And then we reproduce what used to happen. Because there's a huge hiatus, a huge gap in the meantime that we have all lost. We went commercial, everything is the bottom line, and all we're doing is pushing the dollar and pushing the dollar. The vision of this group here in Belize, Regeneration Belize, to transform Belize into a leading producer of nutrient-rich agricultural products and a showcase for carbon sequestration through soil regenerative practice must and can only be achieved through education. We cannot legislate it. And so that's why I said the parliamentary forum to legislate all of this is a show in futility. That has been promoted by the UN. There are conferences all over the world. All parliamentarians come together. My secretary is here to tell you that I was to be in Rome to join that. You know, I didn't go. I don't go to no waste of time conference. It takes travel, go through all these hotels, all these customs, all this foolishness, these long flights and plane to do what? We can't legislate that. We can only educate that. And so this conference is about that. Educating producers, consumers, and the public about the benefits of producing healthy food in an environment of sustainable practices. It's the practices that have to be sustainable. Also, when I hear about sustainable development, what on earth that means? What is sustainable development? Nobody can define it, you know. You have to have sustainable practices. Professor just talked about green cover. That's a sustainable practice. It's not sustainable development. I really don't know what that is. I forgot that when they taught me that at University of Bradford. How can we have a win-win practice which delivers to the consumer the best products while ensuring a decent return to the producer, while respecting Mother Nature and the environment from which our food comes? That is the win-win. How we respect Mother Nature and the environment, how we reward the producer and produce healthily for the consumer. That is the challenge. Because in producing for the consumer now, we disrespect the environment. And the producer is maximizing profits at the expense of the environment, and vice versa. Man living and producing in harmony with his environment is better than man producing in conflict with his environment. The concept of combating climate change, for example, or being resilient to climate change is a losing proposition. And I say that to even the World Bank people that we're just engaging. You cannot combat. That's a battle term. Dr. Huber, whom from his CV I see was a colonel in the military, will tell you battle terms don't work. Nobody ever win in any fight. That's a lose-lose. So, to work with Mother Nature, work with her attributes, work with the things she does. I tell you that because at that same farm I'm telling you about, we brought in some engineers in 1978 to do an area we call Area 6, where we cleared and leveled, put levees, put water gates, everything. I was in my elements. And we surveyed and we aligned everything. I mean, you've never seen anything like that. Scrapers moving and earth-moving machines, etc. And I feel like I'm king of the world. And there's a creek by the name of Gra Creek. Flows into another creek called Batlass Creek. And that is because you have a lot of batlass there, little flies that bite the hell out of you. Take out a chunk out of you. And they all flow into Mussel Creek. And these engineers, they were Polish and British and Germans that we hired from a company called Asphalt at the time, decided they would straighten the creek. And we straightened the creek. And I said to one of the engineers, may I tell you something about here? I don't know about Poland, you know. But here, it rains, what we call man rain. And when man rain come down, and Mother Nature decided she want her creek back like how it was, you will find all those culverts and things somewhere, and 1,000 years from now, archaeologists are going to come through this area, and they're going to be doing PhDs, and they will say, humans were here. Look at these huge boulders. What did they do with these things that look like tunnels? They won't know it's some idiot who tried to straighten out the creek, and Mother Nature put it back where it was. And if I had time, and I had brought them, I would have shown you pictures of that, because that was 1979 when Mother Nature sent us the worst floods we ever had in this country. 1975, the worst drought was more than this year. And 79 was the worst flood. That area of the Western Highway, for those of you who know it, went underwater for a month. And they had to put a bus on one side, bus on the other side, and a high trailer to cross people through. 1 month into Christmas, where I came from, Big Falls, we had 6 miles of water on the road 4 feet deep. And the boom bridge, the old one that they demolished, they were just building it. The pylons went underwater 7 feet. They had to raise that up. And when Mother Nature was finished and decided that, well, this is all fine, I've done what I have to do, Gra Creek was back to how it looked. And we were $3 or $4 million poorer for that foolishness. That's how it is. So the concept of combating climate change can't happen. And you will be resilient, you're shoving out your chest, can't happen. So let us start by saying that we are going to adopt and we are not going to fight. We are going to adopt our practices to prevent soil degradation, greenhouse gases, etc., which we find detrimental. You see, from where I sit, and maybe it's because I'm 73 and old, I just believe that Mother Nature is a powerful girl and I can't fight her, so I don't try that at all. I had my days of that. I had more bulldozers and tractors and anything, and to clear the whole of this area in one fell swoop. And a couple of years ago, there was a hurricane called Hurricane Iris that moved through the Placencia Peninsula. And those of you who live here will remember that Iris only passed over Belize for exactly 3.5 hours. And everything in its path for a distance of about 3 miles, it was like a tornado. All the way right into Guatemala, it went into the Maya Mountains. Everything in its path was flattened. So you drive down the southern highway and you see nice trees, then you see no trees, then you see nice trees. And I tried to figure out in that time how many bulldozers, etc., I would need to have cleared through that, and done that with such precision. That's Mother Nature. I won't try to fight that girl. And so, there will be extended droughts, as the good professor said, and excessive rainfall, and there'll be higher temperatures and deeper freezes. This we must understand. It's a fight man cannot win. So why engage in this fight and in these practices? Is it not better to work with Mother Nature, to adapt to the changing climate, to regenerate our soil, and to produce things like the rice that took 10 or almost 15 years and continue going and continue going and continue going all on its own without me doing anything? In the jungle, where there was rain and drought and drought and rain and rain and drought and drought and rain. Should we overwork and tax our soils to the breaking point, where all the nutrients are depleted and replaced with synthetic substances and chemicals in our quest to earn higher profit? You see, that practice reminds me of a commercial some of you are familiar with that used to run. And the commercial used to say, we take cocaine so we could work harder, so we could earn more money, so we can buy more cocaine, so we can work harder, so we can earn more money, so we... Reminds me of that. You really not getting no way. So, let us then embrace these new, and indeed I'll say, age-old, but newly discovered or rediscovered practices of regenerative agriculture, and find ways to create the win-win in harmony with Mother Nature. Next 2 days, over 12 stages, there will be myriad presentations. We can't all be at all of them. I wish I could clone myself, but I'd love to be at all of them. Not possible. But the contacts we make, the people we speak with, the people with expertise, like Professor Huber, who didn't realize that I was taking notes, because I always take notes on race 4, on an HLB, because those things excite the dickens out of me, how we can solve that without trying to look for some magic bullet which doesn't exist. Those are the kinds of things I'll encourage our people in the ministry to come and listen to, come and hear to, and come and work with. Because at the end of the day, same Pine Ridge soil that we say is not good, who knows, maybe over centuries it was depleted for one reason or another. And the good thing about the Pine Ridge soil, it was always cheap because nobody wanted it. It was always available because you never had to clean it. So you could plant on it right away. One trees grew, pine trees, few and far in between. So it was good, available land with some prickly looking grass on it. that was acidic like hell. And if you did the right thing to that soil, you could turn it into what my dad with his farm, and what I'm still doing where I live, because you would never know that was a Pine Ridge place. So thank you very much, Ms. Beth and your team for promoting this. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. And please invite your friends to join in. There's going to be good days of discussions. Our quest in the ministry is not to create a revolution, because nobody likes a revolution. It's to create an evolution into new and sustainable practices. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, and I think you did a wonderful job in summarizing the next 2 days. It is important for us to acknowledge that the little reception we're going to be having is being donated by the Ministry of Agriculture, Agri-Tropics, and the Belize Ag Report. If anybody has any questions, this is the time. If not, let's move over to our reception and have a little bite of something. And thank you, everybody, and see you tomorrow morning, bright and early.